I'd like to welcome everyone who's here to our program tonight. We'll be speaking about Life in a Jar, the Irena Sendler Project, we have author Jack Mayer here tonight joining us to present this work that he's done, along with a lot of the historical details that go along with it. Just some business we have during the presentation. I think a lot of you are muted. If you could mute yourself during the presentation, not to distract the speaker. Then after the presentation is done, we will have a question and answer period where Jack will be more than happy to answer your questions at that point in time. At this point, like to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know it's a nice night weather-wise, so it's quite tempting to do a lot of other things, but we appreciate your attendance here. Just wanted to say a few words about Jack and welcome and thank him for doing this for us through the Vermont Humanities. It's a joint project between the Friends of Lanpher Library and the Vermont Humanities program in Vermont. Jack wears a lot of hats, but predominantly in one of his lives, he was a pediatrician who started out doing some cancer research at Columbia University. Then when he returned back to Vermont, he came back as in primary care pediatrics and established a practice called Rainbow Pediatrics in Middlebury. He also was an instructor and faculty member of the Department of Pediatrics at UVM. And he also was a pre-medical student advisor at Middlebury College. So that was his medical hat. Walking along with him through his profession as a medical career, he's always been a writer. For 40 years, he's dabbled in writing. He participated in the Bread Loaf Writers Conference for 3 years. He's author of 2 books, one nonfiction, which we'll be discussing tonight, which is Life in a Jar, the Irena Sendler Project, and a historical fiction called Before the Court of Heaven. He's also written a poetry collection called Poems from the Wilderness, which won the Proverse Prize in 2019. And he currently has on the launching pad a second poetry collection called Entanglements, Physics, Love, and Wilderness Dreams, which is due to come out November of this year. I'm proud to say that our librarian, Amy Olson at Lanpher Memorial Library we have purchased the 3 books that are available to purchase at this point in time, so that anyone who wants to borrow any of the 3 books that have been released they're able to borrow them through the Lanpher Library. So without too much further ado, I'd like to welcome Jack Mayer and turn over the speaker responsibilities to him. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Diane. I just deeply appreciate both the Lanpher Library and Diane and Amy Olson for arranging this. And this is a Vermont Humanities Council co-sponsored talk, so I want to just give a shout out to them as well. The Vermont Humanities Council are the stewards, the benefactors, and the curators of the arts in Vermont, which I always think of as our other gorgeous landscape, and they deserve our generous support. So my deep appreciation to them. I also want to give a shout out. I don't know if they're on this Zoom or not, but Patty Cook and the 6 and 20 Book Club, which they've just finished reading Life in a Jar. They're from Wilmington, Ohio, and this book club was established in 1898. It is the oldest, I think it must be the oldest continuously running book club in America. So my greetings to anyone from the 6 and 20 Book Club as well. So I have 3 goals for tonight's presentation. The first, I hope that you'll learn something about the Warsaw Ghetto, just a slice of Holocaust history, and how a Vermont pediatrician came to write Life in a Jar. Secondly, I want to tell you two remarkable stories of the power of one person to change the world. Irena Sendler during World War II, and 60 years later, 3 teenage girls from Kansas. Life in a Jar is really an invitation for us all to emulate Irena Sendler and these 3 Kansas teens. And I just want to also comment on something about Holocaust literature in general, that you know, many Holocaust stories, when I read them, they leave me angry or depressed or helpless. This story, I think, will inspire as well as inform. And it's one of the reasons why I chose to write this. There's also been an amazing impact of Life in a Jar and this project in Poland, and the Polish-Jewish dialogue has been really remarkable in how it has been stimulated by Life in a Jar and these Kansas teenagers. And finally, I want to spend a little bit of time just considering how we teach the Holocaust to this next generation of young people. We want to raise the question of the bystander, which in some sense we all are. And to make a distinction between being an active bystander or an upstander and a passive bystander. In German, the Germans have a better word for bystander, I think, than we do, and it's Mitläufer, and which roughly translates as a fellow traveler. So it refers to people, often the majority, who make their accommodation with evil. So there's an oft-quoted line from the Hebrew Babylonian Talmud, and it goes like this: who saves one person saves the world entire. Norm Kennard, the Kansas social studies teacher who inspired and continues the Irena Sendler Project, painted this paraphrase of that line across the front of his classroom: who changes one person, changes the world. So I'm going to tell you 2 remarkable true stories. The first one about Irena Sendler, a Polish Catholic social worker, a hero of the Holocaust, who rescued 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. And the second story about 3 girls from a small rural high school in Kansas who uncovered Irena Sendler's forgotten story 60 years later and told the world. Liz, Megan, and Sabrina began as students of history, and they became agents of history. Most stories about partisans and about resistance during World War II are about men and fighting. This is a story about women and rescue, and 3 girls from Kansas. The epigraph of my book is by Albert Schweitzer. It goes like this: sometimes our light goes out, but is blown again into instant flame by an encounter with another human being. Each of us owes the deepest thanks to those who have rekindled this inner light. Life in a Jar, the Irena Sendler Project, the true story of a Polish Holocaust hero, a social worker, Irena Sendler, and 3 contemporary teenage girls from Kansas, is a story about people who have rekindled that light. It is an invitation for us all to be inspired to carry this inner light as well. So I want to begin with a disclaimer of sorts. Stories about rescuers like Irena Sendler do not correct the catastrophe of the Holocaust. There is no healing of the Holocaust. We can, as individuals, seek forgiveness for our sins against God, but transgressions of one individual against another must be atoned and redeemed person to person. But you cannot do that after murdering someone. So rescue is not a redemptive postscript to the Holocaust. The harm cannot be redeemed, cannot be undone. Truth and reconciliation, yes, but not healing. And let me offer a secular, more familiar analogy. When a person suffers a heart attack and they're fortunate enough to survive, their heart never completely heals. The scar always remains. And when something as terrible as the Holocaust happens, it too leaves a deep wound, a scar that can never fully heal. And when you have a wounded heart, you have to be careful, and you are never the same. The wound keeps the memory and the history alive so that we don't repeat this catastrophe. By telling these stories, by keeping this history alive, we are caring for this wound that we all share in some way. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a progressive Jewish theologian and a civil rights leader, said of the Holocaust, "Few are guilty, but all are responsible." It is our responsibility to tell this story in all its dimensions as a way of passing the torch of memory to the next generation, because memory is the best immunization against recurrence. It's a light in the darkness. When the last eyewitnesses are gone, when the last survivors succumb to old age, our young people must know this story so they will recognize inhumanity when it returns, as it does with appalling regularity. Bosnia, Cambodia, Rwanda, Nigeria, the Congo, Darfur, Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, and now Ukraine. The list goes on. As a pediatrician, I immunize against infectious disease. As a writer, I invoke memory as our best immunization against the atrocities that humans inflict upon each other, an ethical immunization that fosters justice, love, and respect against the disease of hatred, intolerance, and violence. So I hope you're all seeing these slides. Is it coming on okay?
Yeah, it's fine, Jack.
Okay, so these slides, I just want to use these photographs as a visual grounding for our discussion about the Warsaw Ghetto, and to give you more of a visual sense. One very important thing to keep in mind as you look at these images is that, with the exception of the last image, the last photo, these were all taken by perpetrators. These are photographs that were taken by Nazi photographers. They were used for propaganda purposes back in Germany to further demonize Jews, to show how less than human they were, and to celebrate the German war effort. So keep that in mind as you look at these. So September 1st, 1939 is when the Germans invaded Poland, and that was the beginning of World War II. The Germans were able to basically control all of Warsaw within the first month of the war, and they immediately imposed decrees and laws that were aimed at Jews in particular, as well as Poles in general. But one of the first decrees was that every Jew should be marked with in Warsaw, an armband with the Star of David on it. In other occupied countries, it was the yellow Star of David. This photograph was taken in probably 1942. It's a street scene of the Warsaw Ghetto. What you can see is that everyone over the age of 10 is wearing one of these white armbands with the blue Star of David on it on their right arm. This was required. If you were caught without your armband, if you were lucky, you were arrested. You could also be just shot on the spot and executed. What interests me about this particular photograph is that, with one exception, everybody in this photograph is dressed rather poorly. The children in the front have bare feet. They're wearing rags and poor clothing. Most of the other people are dressed rather poorly. The one exception is this woman who's walking toward the camera, who's dressed very well. She has the armband on her right arm, so we know that she's Jewish. My supposition, I don't know that this is the case, but I think that probably she is part of the black market that developed very quickly in the occupied countries and in the Warsaw Ghetto in particular, which was required for people to be able to secure enough food. one of the early decrees of the Nazis was that there was a very strict food rationing program imposed on Poland. German Poles of German extraction were entitled to full rations of 2,600 calories a day. Catholic Poles, so-called Aryan Poles, were entitled to 700 calories a day, and Jews were given 184 calories a day. Now, these are starvation rations. You cannot survive on that number of calories per day. So this black market developed in order to provide food for both Catholics and the Jews to get enough food to eat. So everybody in Poland suddenly became part of this vast criminal conspiracy in order to get enough food to eat. So you had to be a criminal. If you were not a criminal, you would not survive. You would die of malnutrition. The people who were operating this black market ring became relatively wealthy, and even the Jews in the ghetto who were a part of this conspiracy became relatively wealthy. So this woman is well dressed. She's part of the ghetto aristocracy, if you will. And just to give you a sense of how big and how well established this aristocracy was, there were when they talk about aristocrats in the ghetto, it's estimated that there may have been as many as 10,000 people in the ghetto who were in part of this black market conspiracy. There were 61 cafes and nightclubs and theaters in the ghetto. So it was a little city within a city that had its own criminal conspiracy. The Nazis participated in the black market conspiracy, and they skimmed money off the top. When the Germans invaded in September of 39, a little more than a year later, by November of 1940, November 16th, the Jews were in the ghetto. They had to build the wall around the ghetto themselves. It was slave labor with bricks. The wall was 10 feet high, 11 miles long. It was topped with shards of broken glass, and the Jews built it themselves. This is a photograph of one section of the wall between two buildings. This is the day that the Jews were forcibly put into the ghettos, November 16th, 1940. They could only take with them what they could carry on their backs. And this is people lining up to go into the ghetto, carrying their bundles. People would wear 4, 5, 6 layers of clothing so that they could maximize the amount of clothing they would take with them. To give you a sense of the size of the ghetto and the population of the ghetto, at the beginning of the war, Poland had a population of 35 million altogether. Of that 35 million, about 3.5 million were Jews. So about 10% of the population of Poland was Jewish. Of note, Poland was the place where most of the Jews in the world lived. And even back in the 16th century, 80% of the world's Jews lived in Poland. The name of the country, Poland, comes from a Hebrew word, Polin, which means here you should dwell. So it was a very friendly and accepting place for Jews until the 20th century. So of that 3.5 million Jews in Poland, well, let's talk about Warsaw itself. In Warsaw, the population was 1.3 million, and of that 1.3 million, 360,000 were Jews. So 30% of the population was Jewish. Now, that 30% of the population was squeezed into 2.6% of the area of Warsaw in the ghetto. So it was an intense compression of people. A typical flat a 3-room flat, not a 3-bedroom flat, but a 3-room flat would easily contain 25 people. There would be basically 8 or 9 people to a room in the ghetto, and often people who didn't know each other. So this is where these people are headed for. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest ghetto in all of Europe. It was divided into a large ghetto and a small ghetto, and this is a photograph of the wooden footbridge that connected the large and the small ghetto. What you can see is there's the wall, the two walls in the street in the middle is Chodna Street, and you can see there are automobiles and trams and people normally dressed. On the other sides of the walls, you can see people with their white armbands on, and keep this photo in mind. I'm going to come back to this photo at the end to show you what this looks like today. About 10% of children in the Warsaw Ghetto were beggars. They would sneak through holes in the wall, through openings in the gates. There were 22 gates around in the wall, manned by Polish security and by by SS. But small children could get out through these and through openings and holes in the wall, and they would then be begging for food on the Catholic Aryan side of the wall. These 4 children have just been apprehended by this SS officer behind them. They would mostly try to collect root crops to bring back to their families for food. A few minutes later, a few minutes later, they're emptying the root crops that they have begged for, that they've gathered. And these children are under arrest now. They would be taken to one of the 2 prisons in the Warsaw Ghetto. This was Gęsia prison was where children were taken. And the mortality rate in Gęsia prison was virtually 100%, and children dying of malnutrition, of exposure, of infectious disease. So these children would not have survived the war. A typical street scene in Warsaw. This is the kind of scene that Irena would have walked by on a daily basis that finally inspired her to start taking children out of the ghetto. She was a social worker. Before the war, many of her clients were Jewish. When the ghetto was established, she continued to go into the ghetto to provide them with, and she would sneak in money and food and to just provide them whatever help that she still could. The way she was able to get in was that she had forged documents identifying her as an infection control nurse, so that she could get through the gates, because the Nazis were obsessively paranoid about infectious disease, and there was a lot of infectious disease in the ghetto because of the concentration of people. So there was typhoid and typhus and tuberculosis and many other infectious diseases. So she was able to go in, and as she walked into the ghetto, she would pass this kind of a scene where you can see the 2 children in the middle of this picture with their very thin legs from malnutrition, and they're sitting alone. These were probably orphans. She would pass these orphans on the street, see them every day. When the weather got cold, she would sometimes see them dead in the morning on the streets, having frozen overnight. And she decided to start smuggling these orphans out of the ghetto. She didn't have to ask anybody's permission. She didn't need parents' consent. She would just have them taken out of the ghetto through various ingenious methods. So when the ghetto was first established, there were 350,000 Jews in the ghetto. About 6 months later, that number had swelled to almost 500,000, 460,000, because people from other parts of Europe and other parts of Poland who were fleeing the fighting were coming into Warsaw hoping to find a place for food and for safety and for shelter. This is a photograph of a synagogue in Warsaw that was used as a dormitory. At this point, there was no room for people anymore in flats, so this synagogue was used for shelter. This is a photograph of a roundup of Jews to be taken to Treblinka, the Treblinka death camp, which is where most of Warsaw's Jews were murdered. This is July of 1942. The term was liquidation, which meant that people were rounded up and then brought to concentration camps or death camps. And the way it worked is that the Germans would surround a certain couple of blocks area. They would order everybody out into the street, and then they would be marched through the ghetto to the north end of the ghetto, where there was a train loading platform called Umschlagplatz, where they were loaded into cattle cars and then taken to Treblinka, which was where most of the Jews were murdered in the gas chambers. And usually within 2 hours of their arrival at Treblinka, they were dead. This photograph also is interesting for the three Jewish policemen. If you look in the upper left-hand corner of this photograph, you see these three guys together. They've got peaked caps on. They're wearing the armband that identifies them as Jews. The policemen were part of this aristocracy in the ghetto. They carried out the decrees and the laws passed by the Germans. When the roundups occurred, the Jewish policemen were tasked with rounding up their fellow Jews and then making sure that they paraded through the streets to get to the train loading platform. This is a photograph of the train loading platform, Umschlagplatz. It is anywhere between 5,000 and 13,000 Jews a day would be taken here to be loaded into trains. If there weren't enough trains to take them, the people who were left over would stay in this field by the train loading platform overnight. There was no food, there was no water, there were no toilets, and it was a pretty horrible place. There's a photograph of Jews being loaded into cattle cars for transport to Treblinka. Again, a photograph by Nazi photographers. There's no sense of shame, or there's no sense that this is something that's not right. This is a photograph of an Easter fair, April 1943, April 25th. The uprising against the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began on April 19th, 1943, and about 700 Jews became fighters. They managed to make weapons of their own, landmines, guns, and they rose up against the Nazis, and they held them off for a month. So from April 19th to May 16th, there was this conflagration going on in the ghetto. These pitched battles between the Jewish resistors and against the Nazis. Irena walked by this Easter fair on that day, and I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing Irena before she passed, and she told me about this fair. It was 6 days after the uprising began. The child in this swing. When they get to the top of the arc of the swing, they can look over the wall and see and hear gunfire and machine guns and battles and smoke and explosions. And Irena said to me, it was this very peculiar cognitive dissonance that she was walking on one side of the wall, and on the other side of the wall was this pitched battle going on. So when a child was removed, was taken out of the ghetto by Irena and her network of fellow rescuers, they were first taken to these emergency care homes, and that was to allow them to get forged identity papers. They needed new identities as Polish children. They needed baptismal certificates proving they were baptized and Catholic. And so once and they would be hidden in these homes, these emergency homes. This is one of those homes. There's a false back to this closet where children would be able to hide. And then once they had their new documents and their new identities, they would be placed either in foster care, convents, or orphanages, and where they stayed during the war. The way that Irena's network smuggled these children out of the ghetto there were numerous ways. Small babies were sedated and put in boxes that were then put on trams that went from the ghetto from the parking garage for the trams, which was in the ghetto, to outside of the ghetto. There were holes in the wall. They would go through the sewers. Morgue wagons these children, particularly if they were sedated, would be put in with bodies in the morgue wagons. Some of the smaller children could be carried out in gunny sacks. There was a hygiene wagon that Irena had, which she could put children in under piles of just horrible smelling Band-Aids and dressings with infection smell in them. And the best escape route of all was through the courthouse. And I will tell you one of those stories in a little bit about a courthouse rescue. So this is the photograph not taken by a Nazi photographer. This was taken by an Allied airman flying over Warsaw after the Germans had retreated and were vanquished. And what it shows very graphically is how completely destroyed Warsaw was. And it was not destroyed by bombing, because Warsaw was not bombed. This was done by the Nazis themselves. The Germans, as they were withdrawing, as they were retreating, systematically blew up the city. They just leveled it with explosives. They did not bomb the churches in the ghetto. They left those standing. Everything else was basically destroyed. So Warsaw was a ruined city. So let me just share with you a little bit of my personal history. I'm a German Jew. I was born after the war to parents who narrowly escaped the Holocaust. Others in my family did not. For the first 5 years of my life, I lived in Upper Manhattan in Washington Heights, which was a shtetl of German Jews who had survived the Holocaust. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old. The Holocaust was the baffling but iconic story of my childhood. It was a subject of nervous, hushed adult conversation. For me, the Holocaust was frightening. It was mysterious. It was impossible to grasp, yet it was everywhere. It was the atmosphere. There was this awkward gracelessness on the part of those who had survived the Holocaust, a kind of a furtiveness that I now understand to be a kind of a post-traumatic stress disorder, denial, shame, hypersensitivity, flashbacks, depression. It was the unacknowledged elephant in the living room, huge but shrouded. How did this dreadful silence manifest in my life? It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I first learned that my grandfather had been arrested on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, and imprisoned in Dachau, one of the first concentration camps. In 1999, when I was 40 years old, my parents were interviewed as part of Steven Spielberg's Shoah project, and my mother brought out her identity papers marked Jew and her nursing certificate stamped with a swastika. My brother and I had never seen these artifacts. So how then does a Vermont pediatrician come to write this book and come to be connected to this story? As I sort of was growing up and becoming a young adult, I was an activist for civil rights. I was part of the anti-Vietnam War effort. And the anti-nuclear effort. I was one of the New England delegates to Physicians for Social Responsibility. So I have my background is with social justice issues. In 2001, I was in my office, and this was before electronic medical records, so I would get a ton of mail every day. And every piece of mail had about 2 seconds to be either kept, thrown out, recycled, whatever. But I got this calendar, which is from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. It was their 2002 calendar. I'm a member of the museum, so I send them my donation every year. They send me a calendar every year. I quickly flipped through this calendar, and I came across this picture of Irena Sendlerova. The reason I stopped here is that this photograph of her looks exactly like my niece, Rosie. I looked at it and I said, "Oh, that looks like Rosie." And I said, "No, that's Irena Sendlerova." Huh. I read this paragraph, short paragraph that said she had rescued 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw ghetto. And I scratched my head and I said, "What? Who? I never heard of her." Everybody knows Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler rescued 1,100 Jews from a German concentration camp in Poland. I'm a pediatrician. I'm a Jew. I'm a child survivor of Holocaust victims. Why don't I know this person? So I kept this. And interestingly enough, the Holocaust Museum, they're the arbiters. They know everything about the Holocaust, but they got her wrong. They didn't know much about Irena. They had her birth date wrong. They have her born in 1916. She was born in 1910. And they didn't know if she was still alive. It says unknown next to that. And then it just said that she had rescued these children. So I was intrigued. I kept this calendar. I put it in my desk. I have a folder in my desk that's labeled interesting stuff. And I now have 4 folders labeled interesting stuff. And I would urge each of you to keep a folder of interesting stuff. But so that's where it sat. It sat there for about 3 years until December of 2003. I'm sorry, February of 2004, when I came into my office one night to see a sick child, and on my desk was open a copy of the Ladies' Home Journal, which I don't keep in my waiting room. No offense to the Ladies' Home Journal, but it was open to an article called "The Woman Who Loved Children." And it was an article about Irena Sendler, but more to the point, it was an article about 3 Kansas teenagers who had discovered her forgotten story and had then told the world about it, and had turned her from an unknown Holocaust hero into a Polish national hero. I called their teacher because I was really intrigued by this, and just to get some more information about Irena and the kids and just what was going on here. And he said, "Well, it's interesting that you should call because we're looking for a writer to write the story of both Irena's wartime story and the contemporary story of these 3 Kansas teenagers who found her story." He asked me to send a writing sample, which I did, and then he invited me to come out and meet them. So in November of 2004. I went out to Uniontown, Kansas. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in Bourbon County, Kansas. It's very, very southeastern county of the state. It is one of the lowest income counties in Kansas. It's very rural. And so I had my rental car. I drove from Kansas City Airport, drove into Uniontown, and it was a really sad looking town. I kind of thought like I was in a Dorothea Lange or a Walker Evans photograph of the Depression. Stores were boarded up. There was hardly anybody around. It was really a town that was down on its luck. I walked over to the high school, which was Uniontown High School, which was a small high school, had 120 students in the high school. There was an old brick and mortar kind of building. And I walked in and I met Norm, and I met Liz and Megan and Sabrina, and I just fell in love. I stayed for a little more than a week interviewing them, their families, people from the school board, as many people as I could, and just got a sense of this story and decided that I should try to write this, and then the rest is sort of history. So one of the things that drew me to this story, I mean, there's two things that drew me to the story. One is that it is these two stories. It's a historical account of Irena during the war, but it's also a contemporary story about these three teenagers in Kansas, three very typical American teenagers. But I'm also compelled by stories of rescuers. And you know, during World War II, Poland was arguably the most victimized country in all of occupied Europe. The calculus of rescue in Poland was more severe than in any other country. Hiding or even feeding a Jew was punishable by your death and the death of your family. And this was often carried out very publicly in the street as a warning to other people not to show any kindness or support to Jews. Yet, in spite of that, Yad Vashem, which is the Israeli Holocaust Authority, has recognized more righteous Gentiles from Poland. These are the people who were rescuers of Jews during the war. More righteous Gentiles from Poland than any other country in occupied Europe. As sort of another measure of the silence about the war afterwards, in 1996, the Yad Vashem had identified a little more than 12,000 of these righteous Gentiles, these rescuers. 20 years later, in 2015, that number had grown to over 25,000. And from Poland, there were more than 6,000. So 25%, 1/4 of all of the rescuers in occupied Europe were Polish, and were facing these draconian consequences to being rescuers. One of my sources, and one of the people who I depended on a lot for information about the ghetto, Jacek Liocek, who is a scholar of the Warsaw Ghetto, he said that to rescue one Jew would require anywhere between 10 and 25 rescuers. That was the mathematics of rescue in Poland. So these are people who then put their lives on the line. So what sort of courage did these rescuers possess? What I'd like to do is to read you the story of one rescue. And just by way of introduction, Irena told me this story herself. And this is occurring on the second day of the deportations or the liquidation, when people are being rounded up and sent to Treblinka. Irena and her network now, they're not just rescuing orphans anymore. They're knocking on doors and asking mothers and fathers to give up their children for her to take them out of the ghetto. This particular rescue occurred through the courthouse, and this was the easiest route of escape for Irena and her network, because if the wall went through the middle of the courthouse. So if you had access to the secret underground tunnels in the courthouse, you could walk in on the Jewish side and then come out on the Aryan side very easily. The Nazis finally got hip to this in August of 1942 and shut it down. But at this time, that was still a viable form of escape. You're going to hear a Yiddish plaintive cry. It's Habs Rachmunes, which means please have mercy. There's a reference to the Judenrat, the Jewish council. This was the council that the Nazis, every ghetto had their council of Jews that imposed the decrees on the Jewish population from the Nazis. And there's reference to the large and the small ghetto. I had shown you that wooden footbridge that connects the two. Oh, and I should mention that with every rescue, Irena and her network would record the child's Jewish name. They would record their new Polish name with their forged documents, and they would record where they were hidden. And there were two reasons for this. One was that Irena said they have to know that that after the war, if they would survive, they would know that they were Jewish and they would know what their Jewish name was. And the second, a little more pedestrian, was that Irena and her network were supporting the foster families and the orphanages and convents with money and food. So they had to know where to deliver each, and particularly for the foster families, they had to know where to deliver food, money, and aid for the children. And then these were written on tissue paper that were they were put into jars, and the jars were buried so that they wouldn't be found. Okay, so when the door opened to this is the rescue of Guta Ettinger, and the piece of paper that's recording her has July 23rd, 1942. Guta Ettinger, then there's an arrow, and her new Polish name, which is Zofia Wacek, and her address in Praga, Markowska number 21. When the door opened to Irena at apartment 32, Siepwa number 12, 8-year-old Guta was waiting. She stood very still behind a small battered valise, her legs so thin that her socks would not stay up. Her dark hair, though obviously just washed and braided, was dirty still. Guta's mother tied a small red bow on one braid, then straightened Guta's soiled dress. Irena turned away. She could not watch these last few moments. Mr. Ettinger's voice hoarsened and cracked. Take her quickly. Don't make us think about it any longer. Irena lingered for a moment and repeated the pretense that made this desperate act possible. After the war, you'll be reunited. I don't think so, he whispered, but thank you for that, young lady. Irena took the child's hand and walked her onto Siepwa Street, across the wooden footbridge over Chodna, then up Zalazna Street toward the courthouse. As they neared the ghetto center, the crowds became thicker, noisier, more impatient and gruff. Irena gave Guta morsels of bread as they walked. The girl gripped Irena's hand so tightly that it hurt. Red posters announced executions from the day before, some of them Judenrat members, the longest list Irena had ever seen. In the turmoil and confusion, someone pushed hard between them and broke their hands apart. Guta screamed as she was carried downstream like driftwood in a flood. Irena plunged through the melee and just managed to catch her coat. They forced their way through the throngs into the darkened courthouse lobby, just as crowded as the street, but acoustically augmented by the dark space overhead. Joseph was expecting them, and the escape through the basement tunnels went smoothly. They emerged on Ogradova Street in the Aryan world of relative calm. When the number 25 tram came to a stop, Irena easily picked tiny Guta up in her arms, half as heavy as an 8-year-old should be, and boarded. A gallant young Pole seated across from the tram operator surrendered his seat for Irena and the child. Guta sat on her lap, her face buried in Irena's shoulder. In all the confusion, Irena had said nothing to Guta, who spoke only Yiddish. The rocking of the tram calmed Irena enough for her to feel Guta quivering on her lap and sobbing. Other tram riders began to stare. Irena whispered in her ear in practiced Yiddish, "Be calm, little girl. Your name is Zofia. Don't forget, Zofia." Guta lifted her head and looked at Irena, her eyes brimming with tears, her weeping no longer muffled by Irena's coat, drawing ever more attention. "Habs Rachmunes," Guta cried. This plaintive Yiddish plea had become so ordinary in the ghetto as to go unnoticed. But on this tram, it was a confession punishable by death. Passengers whispered. Guta's sobbing grew louder. She stiffened as if in a seizure. Without warning, the tram operator applied the brake in the middle of the street, throwing passengers off balance. He looked at Guta, then began to shout, everybody out, there's something terribly wrong with the tram. It's not safe. Please leave now, leave as quickly as you can." He walked up and down the car, shooing people out the front and back doors. Irena was about to take Guta off the tram when he came near and whispered, "Not you, please stay." After the last of the passengers had fled, he closed the doors. "Kneel down on the floor," he said. Guta continued to cry loudly in Yiddish. The tram started up again, screeching around corners, rocking Irena and Guta on the floor. After a long and jostled ride, it stopped on a quiet street. The driver turned to Irena. "This is a quiet neighborhood. You're safe now. God be with you." Irena looked into his eyes, those of an ordinary Pole. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do it?" I don't know. I just did it without thinking. You'd better go." Guta held Irena's hand and they walked through Aryan Warsaw, across the bridge over the Vistula River to the Praga district where she would be hidden. Guta's eyes widened with wonder as if she had never seen clean streets, automobiles, and finely dressed women. In this part of Warsaw, there was some food in the shops, and Irena bought Guta a pastry with sugar frosting, which finally quenched her tears. So this tram operator, on an impulse, did something that put his life and his family's life at risk. So what is it that distinguishes a rescuer? Psychologists, Holocaust scholars, social scientists who have studied the phenomenon of rescue are unable to come to discern a consistent dynamic or pattern. It seems that anyone can be a rescuer and anyone can be a perpetrator. Though biography is not destiny, there are clues. And in the case of Irena Sendler, she learned two essential lessons from her father. One, if you see someone drowning, you must rescue them, even if you cannot swim. And second, that there are only two kinds of people in the world, good and bad, regardless of race, religion, or creed. Irena had recruited this network of 10 social workers and 25 liaisons, mostly all young women, who were both on the Jewish side and the Aryan side of the ghetto wall in order to rescue children from certain death in the ghetto or at the Treblinka death camps where Warsaw's Jews were gassed and cremated. Incredibly, after the war, the communist government of Poland considered those who had rescued Jews as outlaws. The communists had no use for freedom fighters. Members of Żegota, the Polish underground, Poland's wartime heroes, were shunned and targeted by the government. Polish rescuers, many of whom had received the Yad Vashem medals as righteous among the nations, hid them and told no one of their wartime activities. Some of these Żegota members were put on trial, they were imprisoned, and some were executed. Irena Sendler was forgotten. She lived in Warsaw in obscurity and poverty with her daughter-in-law and granddaughter in a small flat. Now, here's an astonishing coincidence. On September 23rd, 1999, Irena's son, Adam, suddenly died of heart disease, a heart attack. He was only 49 years old. Irena, then 89, was heartbroken. Her health was failing fast. Unbeknownst to her, that same day, September 23rd, 1999, 3 Kansas girls working on a National History Day project, 2 14-year-olds and a 16-year-old, found a brief reference to Irena's story in a 1995 article in US News and World Report that was entitled "The Other Schindlers." They did an internet search which produced only one hit, which was Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Authority. Irena had been recognized as a righteous Gentile in 1965. A tree had been planted in her honor in 1983. Her tree is planted next to Raoul Wallenberg's tree. Yad Vashem seemed to be the only ones who knew what she had done. And from this fragile beginning, they fashioned a short play about Irena's rescues for their National History Day project. They called the play Life in a Jar because Irena and her co-conspirators kept lists of the children they rescued and buried those lists in jars under an apple tree. Irena's hope was that the rescued children would be reunited with family, or at the very least, they would know their real names and that they were Jewish. Of course, virtually all of their parents were murdered at Treblinka. And in the post-war chaos of Warsaw, there was precious little that could be done with the lists to reunite any sort of family. Why did she do it? And I asked her that question. And it was impossible for Irena Sendler to be a bystander. She said, the way she phrased it was a need of my heart. She said it was her father's teachings. She rejected the characterization of hero. No, she said, it was the mothers and fathers, the grandparents, who gave up their children to save them. They were the heroes. She said it was the children. The babies were the heroes of their mothers' hearts. To the day of her death, she insisted that she did not do enough and lamented that for every child they saved, almost 100 went to their deaths at Treblinka. I asked her if she was afraid. She said, yes, of course she was afraid. And she was full of doubts. But she was also compelled by indignation and by determination. And she did not let fear deter her from acting. I would suggest that fear is the handmaiden of courage. When we embrace our fear at these moments of decision, when courage is required, we're invited to be brave. A friend of mine, a psychiatrist who fought against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, said to me before he passed away, if you're not scared, it isn't courage. So who are these Kansas girls? Liz, Megan, and Sabrina, typical American teenagers from a small rural high school in one of the most economically depressed school districts in Kansas, in which there had never been a Jew, never a person of color, never even a Catholic, so no diversity. And each of these three Kansas girls carries her own burden of pain, her own weighty challenge having to do with their mothers. Yet they pursued this project about mothers giving up their children in order to save them. The teenagers from Kansas each display unusual courage to initiate and carry on this project, which evoked such strong and difficult emotions. They immersed themselves in a sewer of Holocaust research. They sought the traumatic testimonies of survivors, and they confronted Auschwitz and Treblinka. Most courageous of all, they allowed me to tell their painful personal stories. Indeed, the last children that Irena Sendler rescued were arguably the girls from Kansas, even as they were rescuing her. In Poland, the Kansas girls helped to crack open the silence and to create Polish-Jewish dialogue about the Holocaust with Life in a Jar. Emboldened by Irena Sendler and the Kansas girls, other rescuers have come forward to tell their stories and display their Yad Vashem medals. Young people in Poland have been inspired by Life in a Jar to find the rescuers in their communities and tell their stories. Are we okay time-wise? Still, Diane?
Yeah, we're doing fine. It's just been an hour. Yep.
Okay. All right. Good. I just want to briefly tell the story of one when the girls have gone to Kansas, have gone to Poland now many times to put on this play, and my wife and I went with them in 2005. And we attended one of the performances in Warsaw, and they were with some Polish teenagers that they were working with to tell the stories of rescuers from their communities. And I was sitting next to this elderly gentleman during the performance who was clearly old enough to have been an adult during the war. And all through the performance, he was sitting with his hands cupped like this around something. And at the end of the performance, Megan came over, introduced me to him, and introduced me to the Polish teenagers that she was working with. And I asked this gentleman, what was he holding? And he said, and he opened his hand, and he showed me his Yad Vashem, his medal from Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile. And he explained to me that he had kept this hidden in his basement, that only his wife knew about this. He hadn't told his children, hadn't told his friends, hadn't told his family, his coworkers. And he said, now, with what these American teenagers have done, and what these Polish teenagers from his community have done, it allowed him to finally bring this medal up from hiding and to tell his story of what he said was the finest thing he had done in his life. This thing with the Polish teenagers is really dramatic and large because, you know, as I said before, for thousands of years, Jews have made Poland their home. Before the war, most of the world's Jews lived in Poland. Today, there are, like 3.5 million Jews. Today, there are maybe 20 or 25,000 Jews in Poland. Young Poles, those who grew up in post-communist Poland, see this giant fissure, this breach in Poland's history, and they want to know what happened to the Jews. In 2003, a Holocaust curriculum was established in all Polish schools for students ages 9 to 18. It's one of the few places where this curriculum is required. And before this, there was none. One of the authors of this curriculum, Robert Schuchter, was a fellow with the Irena Sendler Life in a Jar Foundation in Kansas and had been trained by the folks in Kansas to with this primary source project-based learning to tell these stories of unsung heroes. So the educational dimension of the Irena Sendler Project really gets to the heart of questions about Holocaust education. According to a recent survey, many adults and even more millennials, those who are 18 to 40 years old, lack basic knowledge about the Holocaust. How we tell this story matters. How do we capture young people's attention, their passion? How do we appeal to their better angels? Can we teach empathy, the inclination to goodness, to rescue? For this history to matter, it must be vivid, it must be personal and compelling. It should keep young readers up at night. It should bring them to tears. It should be contemporary as well as historical. It must be their story as well. Life in a Jar, the Irena Sendler Project, is this intertwined story of a Holocaust rescuer, an extraordinary story of courage and decency in the Warsaw Ghetto, and 60 years later, 3 high school girls, not unlike high school students anywhere in the world today, who rescued the rescuer. That's something that Michael Glowinski told me. Michael Glowinski is a Polish scholar who was rescued by Irena's network as a child. And he said of the Kansas girls that they rescued the rescuer. Though I suspect few of us would be as courageous as Irena Sendler, each one of us could be like Liz, Megan, and Sabrina. Indeed, every act of repair, tikkun olam in Hebrew, no matter how small, is an act of rescue. In writing this book, the question that hung over my head like a sword of Damocles was, what would I have done? We cannot know, but we can affirm our desire to do whatever we can to repair the world, to follow the need of our hearts, mindful of, but undeterred by our fears and doubts. Liz, Megan, and Sabrina began as students of history and became agents of history. The power of one teenager to repair the world. Their teacher, Norm Kennard, retired from teaching to create and direct the Irena Sendler Life in a Jar Foundation, which he continues to do now to inspire high school students worldwide to engage in similar projects focusing on unsung heroes in history who fostered respect and understanding of all, regardless of race, religion, or creed. It's the power of one social studies teacher to repair the world. And of course, Irena Sendler, the power of one social worker to repair the world. 2,000 years ago, a Hebrew sage said, "It is not for us to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it." No one of us can fix the whole mess we are in, but each and every one of us is a carpenter endowed with our own unique tools. The torch of history illuminates our work area, and we are inspired to repair each in our own small way what we can. Irena Sendler, Megan, Liz, Sabrina, the students we teach or parent or mentor, all of us, our families, our friends can do something. My fondest wish, my hope, my prayer is that after reading this book, young people another generation removed from the Holocaust will remember Irena Sendler and the Warsaw Ghetto and be inspired by these Kansas teens to do their small part to repair the world. We are all stars in a dark, dark night, and it is our charge to shine. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to take questions, comments.
Everyone can probably unmute at this point, and instead of using the chat, we could probably just wave our hands and raise the question for Jack.
Oh, before we start questions, let me just go back here. I said I would show this. So if you remember well, when I first went to Poland with the girls in 2005, I had maps of the ghetto. I knew I had already done a ton of research on it. I knew exactly where the wall was, but I could find no commemoration of it anywhere. So it was as if the wall hadn't existed. When I returned in 2013, when the Polish translation of my book was released in Poland, there is now a boundary marker around the entire wall. This is a photograph of it. It says so you cannot step over where the wall was without reading this inscription and seeing this, seeing these boundary markers of the ghetto. There is also, at each of the 22 gates, there's one of these cenotaphs erected, which has a map of a bas-relief map of the Warsaw Ghetto superimposed on a map of Warsaw, an image of Warsaw, and below is a very concise but detailed description of what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is that photograph I showed you of the large and the small ghetto with the footbridge connecting. When I was there in 2005 with the girls, there was no evidence of this anywhere. So this was a very important structure. No commemoration, no identification of it at all. We sat at a cafe right down here at the base of the footbridge, and Chodna Street is there, has the same cobblestones as it did during the war, but no evidence of the footbridge. Today, there are these two giant steel sculptures that commemorate the footbridge, and at the base of each of these is this giant searchlight. It's a blue light that shines up into the sky at night, and it's a huge manifestation of the ghetto. At the base is a view box where you can see these three-dimensional photos of the Warsaw Ghetto, very dramatic. So in 2013, I also spoke at a school in Warsaw. That's the Irena Sendler School. There are now 35 Irena Sendler schools in Poland. There's 3 in France. There's, 3 in Germany. That's something. 1 in France, 1 in England, 1 in Brazil. So after being completely unknown, now there are schools all over the world that are named for Irena Sendler. These are the girls at their first visit with Irena in 2001, when they first met her after discovering that she was still alive. This is Sabrina. Well, from left to right, it's Megan, Liz, and Sabrina. This is at one of the productions, one of the play productions with Polish teenagers who they were working with. This is Irena when she started rescuing kids from the ghetto at age 29. And here this is her nursing. And then we were at her 95th birthday party in 2005. And for those of you who have read the book, you know that there's Elżbieta Fikowska, who is shown here on the left with Liz. She was rescued as a 5-month-old baby from the ghetto in a carpenter's. Irena put her in a carpenter's box, and then put the carpenter's and her mother, Elżbieta's mother, put this silver spoon in the box with her. It's the only only thing that she has of her family or of her parents is the silver spoon inscribed with her name, and that she still has to this day. And she was a caregiver for Irena in her later years. More of the pictures of the play, putting on the play. The lists were buried in the backyard of one of Irena's co-conspirators, Hanna Piotrowska. She still lives there in that same, or her daughter still lives there in that same house where the jars were buried. And they were buried under an apple tree, and the apple tree is still there. It's quite tired and old, but still produces a couple of apples every year. So now, your questions, your comments, whatever.
Thank you, Jack. That was excellent. You can unmute yourself, Barbara? Oh, there.
Yes. Well, I want to thank Jack so much for this. It makes me cry to think about it. See, my mother was born that same year in Poland, very close to where Irena lived, but she was lucky enough to come to the United States in when she was 4 with her family. So she didn't experience any of this, but I have her picture right next, that picture of Irena with the braid across her head. Right next to my mom. They look so much alike. So that makes it so close to me. But I remember that because I read several books, but it's been a while. So I need to go back and read Jack's book again. But I just remember that she wanted, or one of the big things was that she wanted everybody that was part of this network to get acknowledged too. She wasn't just by herself saving 2,500 children. She had that network of people that were so invaluable to the whole thing working and what they went through. And I think you mentioned, Jack, about how they were in jeopardy of losing their life and their family and everything from that. But that just stays in my head that and I know you saw this with her, that she didn't want to be said to be the hero, but the whole network of people. So I guess I just, all the way through what you're saying, I'm thinking about all those other people too.
Yes, and when I interviewed her, and we spent a long time together. She just kept on talking. She didn't want to stop. But she made it very clear to me exactly what you just said, that I'm not a hero. I just did what was decent, and the real heroes are all these other people, part of my network. And I want to make sure that you get all of their names right. And she made sure that I had the spelling correct of every person's name. And yeah, so she was very, very humble about what she had done.
Well, thank you so much for the work you did on this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it made such a large impact on the world, because I'm sure bringing that forward to the point of it being translated in Poland reawakened their history. So the legacy of that are all those schools that you mentioned, and it's just phenomenal. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah, they really cracked open the silence about the Holocaust in Poland, and it has, you can't put that back in the jar once you've uncorked it. So,
Jack, do you know if any of the children she rescued did find any family?
Yes, they did. And this is a complicated part of this story, because the list, there were two jars that held the lists, and Irena and her co-conspirator Yaga dug them up after the war. One of the bottles had broken, and the lists were ruined. They were useless. The other one, they were able to give to Adolf Berman, who himself was in the ghetto and had escaped from the ghetto and went to Israel, and had access to journalists in Israel. And they did try to identify, and there were some reunions of uncles and aunts and relatives of some of these kids. The problem was, and Irena expressed this, was that some of the younger kids thought that their Polish family was their biological family. they didn't know anything different. And when they were growing up, after the war, you didn't say, if you rescued a Jewish child, you didn't say anything about that. So you had to convince the child and everybody else that this was your biological child. And then these relatives, from most of whom were in Israel, came and took these kids back into their families. So they, some of these children experienced a second loss. They were, after being taken away from their original family, then now they were taken away from their foster families. And for some kids, it was problematic. That didn't happen very often. And the vast majority of these kids had no relatives. They were all killed during the war. So the list, there are about 650 names that they're able to make out on these lists, which are in Jerusalem. They went to Israel, where there were some reunions.
Excellent. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions and or discussions or points that you would like to make. Go ahead, Patty. Unmute yourself.
Oh, Patty Cook. Okay.
There you go.
Hi, Dr. Mayer. How are you?
Hi, Patty Cook. You're the 6 and 20 club.
It's 1898. Yeah.
Wow, that's the oldest book club in America.
I really enjoyed this evening with you, and I just feel like you're a new friend with all the corresponding we've been doing, and I'm most grateful.
Thank you.
Think our 6 and 20 club much enjoyed everything and knowing about you. I don't present like you do, but
well, thank you. I
certainly
appreciate
enlightening. Yeah,
Good. I appreciate your club and send them my greetings too.
I will. Thank you.
Any other comments? Oh, Mindy?
I'm part of 6 and 22, and I thank Patty for sending this out to our group. And I'm so glad that I was able to be a part of this evening and listen to your very powerful story. I'm curious to know if you know of groups in the United States that have picked up the girls' beginning of this play, and if it's kind of routinely done in different places in the United States.
Well, they ask that if other schools want to get a copy of the script for the play, that they get permission from the Kansas folks. And if you just Google irenasendler.org, you'll get right to their website. So they just want to be sure that no one is misusing the play for other purposes. There also is a DVD of the play, which you can get through that website as well, it will make you weep. It is the most beautiful. It's about a half an hour long, and it's splendid. It's the sort of the final version of the play, because they kept updating the play as they learned more about Irena and what she had done, and when they met her and then interviewed her, and she told them about what she had done, and that the play is now about a half an hour long, and it's beautiful. It's really lovely. So
Thank you for bringing this to life for us.
thank you for sharing it. And
Thanks.
this book also goes from person to person. I mean, I'm not a marketer, and this book has sold over 100,000 copies, and it's really by word of mouth, and it's person to person. I also give 60% of my author royalties. I give to the foundation, to the Irena Sendler Foundation. So, just buying the book is an act of repair, because you're supporting this wonderful project that is still going on. It's been interrupted by COVID, but by the pandemic, but it's still, they're still going on.
Excellent. Okay, well, I guess if there are no other questions or comments, we'll wrap up the session. And I can't thank Jack enough for agreeing to do this for us. Thank you so much. We this has been a wish of mine for many years. I think Amy Olson, our librarian, understands that I've been trying to get this program up and going and presented for prior to the pandemic. We had to cancel Jack as the pandemic flared up, and at that point Zoom was quite remote as a word. We had no knowledge of what Zoom was at the beginning of COVID, but we are all quite familiar with it now. And because of COVID, some of the silver lining is that we have been able to offer some of these programs remotely and be able to join up with people from all over the country, locally, whatever, in a very comfortable and safe way. So thank you all for participating, and wish you well, and let's do good deeds and let our star shine in the sky.
Amen.